If QE were well understood, our defense, infrastructure, and social programs would not be underfunded. Hello, my name is Edward Sonino. Thanks for tuning in. Most politicians and economists are mistakenly alarmed at what they believe is the United States' unsustainable federal debt and feel constrained by our budget deficits, leading them to underfund defense, infrastructure, and social programs to the detriment of national security, of world democracy and human rights, of free trade, and of our social and economic prosperity. The same goes for the Eurozone. The result of incompetent economic policies has been a long, deep recession with very high unemployment, an agonizingly slow economic recovery, a weak financial sector, social and political instability, foreign policy failures due to military weakness and unpreparedness, increasing terrorism, and a general feeling of impotence. There can be no doubt that if the United States realized it had no real federal debt problem, and if the Eurozone realized it had no real sovereign debt problem, funding of defense, infrastructure, and social programs would be much greater, economic growth, employment, and wage earnings would be much stronger, poverty and social tensions much lower. So, why is there no widespread understanding that there is no real federal debt problem in the US and no real sovereign debt problem in the Eurozone? Simply because there is no full understanding of QE, that is, of quantitative easing by the central banks. With full understanding of QE, the United States and the Eurozone would realize they have no real debt problem, and the result would be more QE financing of government debt for increased spending on necessary defense, infrastructure, and social programs, along with QE financing of sufficiently large tax rebates in order to increase personal income and consumer spending, thereby stimulating economic growth to the point of full employment. QE financed tax rebates of around $2,000 to $3,000 are needed today in the United States, while the Eurozone would need a QE-financed tax rebate of 5,000 euros per taxpayer. Since QE consists of central bank purchases of government bonds with newly created money, QE consists of printed money. And when central banks keep their holdings of government bonds all the way to maturity, those bonds end up costing absolutely nothing, either in terms of interest or capital. In fact, central banks are arms of their respective governments, and they return to their respective treasury departments all annual interest payments received on their government bond holdings, and upon maturity of any government bond, they return the capital repayment to their respective treasury departments. So, with QE, maturing government bonds held to maturity get extinguished at absolutely no cost. In effect, the central banks print not only the capital costs of the bonds, but also the interest costs. That is why government bonds held by central banks to maturity are essentially only virtual debt, not real debt. Importantly, as we have seen, although QE is printed money, it is not inflationary per se. That is, it does not cause inflation so long as it is properly calibrated so as not to create excess aggregate demand. In the United States, the Federal Reserve has financed over $3 trillion of U.S. Treasury bonds over recent years, yet inflation has not only not risen, it has remained at historical lows. Once all this is understood, the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank will feel free to engage in as much QE as is needed to properly fund defense, infrastructure, and social programs and tax rebates. The only limit to QE financing is when full employment and full capacity utilization are approached. Furthermore, it should be clear that QE-financed tax rebates should become the standard economic stimulus tool whenever an economy slows and unemployment starts rising due to insufficient consumption, for two reasons. First, tax rebates are instantly effective since they can be mailed out in a matter of days, thereby immediately increasing personal income and consequently personal spending. Second, they are fair, since each and every taxpayer receives the exact same stimulus check. There is no favoritism, no discrimination, so no citizen has reason to complain. For historical perspective, had Obama's largely ineffective and unfair $800 billion targeted stimulus program in 2009 consisted exclusively of a tax rebate, each taxpayer would have received a $5,000 check. A family of 2 taxpayers would have received 2 checks totaling $10,000. Not only would the economy have been immediately stimulated, with consumer spending rising substantially, but the housing and financial crisis would have been stopped in its tracks, as families in financial difficulty would have suddenly had the means to keep current on their mortgages. Thanks for your attention.